So this webinar today on reserve funds and long-term planning will be recorded. The second I will share is that your lines are going to be muted. It would be helpful if you mute your lines yourselves, but if I do hear some feedback, I'm going to go through and mute people as I go along. This is to kind of help avoid any feedback that might make it hard to hear Laird's presentation. So you know, please try as best you can to keep your lines muted. And I'll also share that if you have any questions throughout this webinar, you can ask them using the chat function on your screen. And to better help Laird answer your questions today, when you're asking a question, please share the type of government that you're with, such as a town or village, because the answer might change depending on your role. And with that, I will turn it over to Carla Fowler, who is sometimes fondly known as the Grants Lady by Tug Hill Communities. She's the Tug Hill Commission's Community Development Specialist. Go ahead and take it away and share some information about the organization and our presenter today, Carla.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
How's that? Is there feedback? I'll just get started, and you holler out at me if it gets fuzzy. But thank you very much, Emily, for doing this, and good afternoon. As Emily said, my name is Carla Fowler, and I work for the Tug Hill Commission. We're pleased to host today's webinar on reserve funds and long-term planning that the Office of the State Comptroller's Syracuse Regional Office has graciously agreed to present for our communities. And thank you all for taking time to join us today. I see some folks are from outside the region. Welcome. We're glad that you're here because this topic is certainly relevant for local officials throughout the state. For those who may not know, the Tug Hill region covers 2,100 square miles in portions of Jefferson, Lewis, Oneida, and Oswego counties, and includes 41 towns and 18 villages. We are a small, non-regulatory state agency that provides technical assistance in the program areas of land use planning, community and economic development, and natural resource management. And you can see our regional map there. Some may know that we organize an annual local government conference that averages over 650 attendees at Jefferson Community College every March. Excuse me. Today's presentation was originally scheduled for this conference, and although we miss seeing you in person that day, we're hopeful that you'll enjoy this webinar and visit our website for a recording of this webinar, as well as several other presentations originally scheduled for that day. I'll share the link in the chat section in a minute. Today's presenter is Mr. Laird Petrie. Laird is an associate examiner with the Office of the State Comptroller's Division of Local Government and School Accountability. He's been with the Comptroller's office for 26 years, working out of the Syracuse Regional Office, which services local governments in their 8-county Central New York region. In addition to providing training to local officials, Laird conducts audits of school districts and local governments and is also the Syracuse Office Technical Assistance Coordinator. Whew. Without further ado, Laird Petrie.
Let me see if I can get my PowerPoint slides going here. Can everybody see my screen?
Yes, we can see it shows the front page and the next slide still, but we can just work with that.
Yeah, I kept trying to change it, but it doesn't seem to want to cooperate for me. So I guess we're probably gonna have to, rather than waste time on that, we'll probably have to make do with this. So, okay. Well, good afternoon, everybody. I hope everybody's staying safe in these crazy times. Today, we're going to be discussing reserve funds and long-term planning initiatives. And given the uncertain times that lie ahead for local governments, this topic is particularly important today. So as you know, as local government, state and federal revenues are declining in the coming years due to the impact of the coronavirus and other factors, it's going to be necessary for local governments to fall back on fund balances that have been set aside for times such as this. So when we talk about reserve funds in conjunction with long-term plans, they're important tools for insulating your government from the harmful effects of such times. Unfortunately, if your government hasn't accumulated sufficient rainy day funds, your board may have to find alternate ways to provide necessary services and or significantly increase property taxes. So hopefully something you're going to learn today will help you be better prepared for the next unforeseen event. So having that said, I guess let's get started. Okay, so what are some of our learning objectives today? We're gonna talk about what are reserves, what is their purpose, what's the benefit of using reserves. We're going to talk a little bit about how to establish them legally, and then we're going to talk about the administration of reserves, the record keeping and the accounting and the bank accounts and those issues, and then we'll talk a little bit about common reserves that are used and talk about how to establish them and various other issues related to those. And, the major focus today on presentation will be on reserve funds. However, reserves are intended to be used as a long-term planning tool. So, we'll be discussing how to use reserves in conjunction with long-term plans. So hopefully we'll have time to cover all those learning objectives. The publication on your screen right now, it's our local management guide titled Reserve Funds. I would strongly encourage you to go to our website that's on the top of that slide and get a copy of that reserve fund publication. You can save it electronically. You can print it off in a PDF format, or you can even apply to our Albany office and get a bound copy of this. Some of you may already have this. It's a popular publication that people pick up at our local government conferences when they stop by the OSC booth. So some of you may have it, but if you don't, I would really strongly suggest that you get it because there's a wealth of information in there. It talks about every type of reserve that local governments and school districts can create. It talks about the purpose of them, who can create them, how to create them, what source of funds you can use for them. It talks about limitations on the spending and the balances. And then it also goes on to talk about what do you do with unexpended balances. So it's an excellent, excellent publication. I can't stress that enough. So what are reserve funds? Basically, it's just a way that you can legally save money for future contingencies, for whether they're infrastructure, equipment, or operational purposes. Once created, they become a portion of your total fund balance, which is classified as restricted. And we're going to talk a little bit more about fund balance here in the next couple of slides because it's so important to understand fund balance if you're going to understand how reserves play a part in that. Okay. And legally established, and I want to stress the fact that we're going to be talking legally established reserve funds as opposed to what we call accounting reserves sometimes. There's a lot of what we call accounting reserves that are established to restrict certain revenues for various purposes, like excess dog control monies in towns and things like that. Sometimes inventories are created like an accounting reserve. So we're going to be talking today about legally established reserves. Okay. So as I mentioned, in order to really understand the part that reserves play in your fund balance, you really have to understand fund balance. And I do an entire training session just on fund balance and how to create, structured balanced budgets and using fund balance, properly managed fund balance. So talk a little bit about fund balance. I wish we had more time to do that, but we'll just touch on the important parts of it. Basically, fund balance is just the total accumulation of all of your operating surpluses and deficits since the beginning of your local government. So, and at the end of the year, it's usually classified as either there's a restricted portion if you've established reserves and an unrestricted portion. So the restricted portion is the legally established reserve funds that we're going to be talking about. Most of these legally restricted reserves are going to be reported on the balance sheets of your local governments. Usually they use the account codes 814 through 899. So this chart's going to be just a little simplistic display of how fund balance really evolves. And because in talking to governing boards after audits, during audits, and during trading sessions, I realized that a lot of governing board officials and employees don't really understand fund balance. And it's probably the most important concept for maintaining fiscal health.
This meeting is being recorded.
So looking at this, sorry, I got a question. So beginning, look at this.
Sorry, I'm not sure why that's happening.
I'm getting a lot of feedback here.
Let me see if somebody needs to mute their line. Did that help?
Yeah.
Okay. Yes, please mute your lines when you join. Otherwise I have to find out who's making noise and mute you myself.
Okay. So hopefully we've still got the chart up there. It says evolution of fund balance, and we'll just quickly go through this. It's kind of a simplistic view, but sometimes it's helpful to understand fund balance by just looking at this. So the fund balance in year one, if this was the very first year of your government existence, for instance, that you ended up having $100 worth of revenues that you received and you spent $75 during the year, then at the end of the year, you'd have a $25 fund balance. If the board does nothing with that $25 to restrict it by way of establishing reserve funds that we're going to talk about, then the entire portion of your fund balance would be unrestricted at that point. So year two, you're starting with $25 fund balance from the year before. And in this particular year, it looks like revenues are exceeding expenditures by another $10. So you have $35 now, total fund balance at the end of year two. Now at the end of the year, this governing board decided we're going to put $10 of our fund balance into a capital reserve to save up for a town hall. So in this case, now their fund balance, which totals $35, 10 of it is restricted and 25 is unrestricted. And it goes on like this year three, where, for instance, we have expenditures exceeding revenues by $10. So now your total fund balance has dropped to $25. The board takes no more action on restricting anymore. So you still have $10 restricted from the actions of the governing board from the previous year. And then the next year, where we get another $10 operating surplus, bringing you back to a total fund balance of $35. The board decides to put an additional $10 in. So at the end of year four, of your $35 total fund balance, 20 of that is restricted. So and it goes year after year after year. So you're going to start the beginning of every year with the ending fund balance from the previous year. And hopefully at the end of each year, you'll change the composition of that fund balance in line with hopefully some of your long-term plans that we're going to talk about later. So the purpose of reserve funds is that reserves should only be established with a plan in mind. You should have a reserve fund policy that talks about the different reserves that the board wishes to establish. The reserve fund policy should be very transparent. It should be able to inform taxpayers exactly what their monies are being saved up for. The fund balance policy or the reserve fund policy should also provide some insight as to when and how they expect to expend from it, and also when and how they hope to replenish it after expending some of it. So that's how you should be using, and the purpose of reserve funds. What you should not be doing is just dumping money into reserve funds just to hide or disguise surpluses that get generated every year. And for examples of how we find that in our audits an awful lot, you could go to our website and look at the audit reports. We have a lot of school districts that get criticized quite often for having reserve funds that really aren't linked to any long-term plan or any plan for that matter. A lot of them don't even have a reserve policy that describes why and how they're having these reserves. And a lot of the school districts that we look at and board members are pretty candid about telling you that, well, a lot of times we put money in reserves at the end of the year because we're restricted to 4% of unrestricted fund balance at the end of the year. So that's how to not use reserves. Hopefully we're going to talk a little bit more about how you should properly use it. So some of the benefits of using reserves, and I try to sell reserves to local officials all the time during my trainings and my audits and technical assistance calls that I get. And to be honest with you, they're a tough sell sometimes because a lot of board members view legally creating and establishing reserve funds as being too cumbersome, too burdensome and that feels that it ties their hands during the year. And hopefully something that you learned today will make you realize that really there's so many more benefits of having reserves than there is drawbacks. So one of the benefits is that it is a good tool or source for long-term planning. Obviously, it's going to reduce your need to borrow, therefore, it's going to reduce future interest payments on borrowings. One big advantage a lot of people don't think about is it provides matching funds for grant opportunities. There are a lot of grant opportunities out there that require you to have matching funds in order to qualify. So these people that administer grants sometimes will look at applications from local governments that have reserve funds established so that they can provide those matching funds. And that gives them a kind of a leg up on the other people applying at that point. And, it provides for future contingencies like we're in right now with the coronavirus. And the last bullet down there, I want to really talk a little bit about because it really protects your fund balance from unwarranted or political reductions. And I see that a lot in our audits. We talk to board members after audits, and a lot of the times when we're looking at a local government that's at fiscal stress, for instance, we find that a few years before that, their fund balances may have been at least reasonable or perhaps even excessive. But because the governing boards back then didn't take any steps to legally protect it by putting it into reserves, it left everything vulnerable to future boards as far as being able to appropriate in their budgets and bring about huge tax reductions for whatever reasons, whether they're political or whatever. But that's the sad thing, is that if you don't take the steps to protect a portion of your fund balance, then someday it's going to come back and bite you. We see it over and over and over. Almost every government that I have ever audited that is currently in fiscal stress got there because they didn't manage their fund balance properly and they did not protect a portion of it. So reserves are an excellent tool for protecting that fund balance. I'm surprised when I talk to local government officials and when I pull up financial reports that get sent into our office. I'm really surprised how many local governments do not report reserve funds. And so prior to preparing for one of these presentations, I usually do some cold posts out of our data warehouse in Albany, where your financial reports get sent into. And I just try to determine how many local governments are taking advantage of establishing reserve funds. So for this presentation, I just looked at a 4-county area, being Jefferson, Lewis, Oneida, and Oswego County. And I looked at all of the financial reports for villages, towns, and cities. And as you can see by that chart, there's 143 local governments that are represented in those 4 counties. Actually, it'd be 147 counting the 4 counties. So of those 143 local governments, when I look at reserves that are reported for fiscal year 2019, we found 31 villages, 20 towns, and 2 cities that report reserves of, as you can see, the number of reserves, like villages are, the 31 villages reported 84. So they have an average of 2-point-something reserves per unit. And same thing with towns and cities, or the ratio is a little higher. But unfortunately, that 53 governments is only 30%, 37% of the 143 municipalities that I did code polls on. So that, that tells you that 63% of these municipalities in this 4-county area are not reporting reserve funds. So I think we need to do a little bit more work on our end to sell the concept of legally establishing reserve funds. This chart just kind of tells you of the types of reserves that we have, which are the most popular ones. And it's no surprise to me anyhow that capital reserves are always the most prevalent capital reserves in financial reports, followed by repair reserves and then a few other miscellaneous like debt and tax stabilization. And we're going to talk about some of these, certainly the capital repair and a few of these more common ones. So 61% of the total reserves reported by this 4-county area is capital reserves. And 46 of the governments report a capital reserve. And then I further analyzed it just a little bit more just to kind of see which funds are being reported reserves in. And of the total 30 point something $1 million in reported reserves, 40% of them are in the general fund. And that's not a surprise to me. That's and then the highway fund is next with the 17%. So what surprised me a little bit is the fact that there were 6 governments reporting reserves in the capital project fund. Prior to 2001, that wouldn't have surprised me, but after 2001, reserves were required to be reported in the fund that was financing them. So capital reserves prior to 2001 used to be reported in the capital project fund, the H fund. Shouldn't be reported that way since 2001 unless the government has transferred some capital reserve fund monies from another fund over to the capital project fund to fund a project, and at the end of the year there were still reserve monies left that haven't been unspent at that point, then they perhaps would be correct in reporting a capital project or capital reserve in the capital project fund. But I suspect that there's maybe a few of the 6 that are reported here that are probably being improperly reported. Okay. So we'll talk a little bit about how to establish reserve funds. Okay. Again, going back to the slide we talked about, the difference between legally established reserves versus accounting reserves. When we're talking about legally established, is that have been established pursuant to law, they require board resolution. Quite often, the board resolution has to be subject to be public notice and some referendum requirements, depending on whether it's a town, village, city, county, fire district, school district, or whatever. So the rules are a little bit different for every different type of local government. And going back to that local management guide manual that we talked about on one of the first couple of slides, that manual does a really good job of explaining each reserve for each type of local government and which type of government requires the public notice and referendum. So the majority of our reserves are established by general municipal law, section 6C through currently it's 6T now. Every year it seems like we keep, legislators keep allowing and authorizing the establishment of a different type of reserve. Some of those reserves, the general municipal law reserves, are available to all local governments. Some are only available to like fire districts or to towns and villages, for instance. Okay. The laws that pertain to town law, section 55, 55A, and 55B, those are for suburban towns. Doubt if we have anybody in attendance now that's from a suburban town, but it's possible. We have a few of them in our region, but suburban towns are usually towns that have a population of at least 25,000 or a town that has at least 7,500 population and is within 15 miles of a city that has more than 100,000 people. So there are a few reserves that are available for suburban towns through the town law, sections 55, that are not available for other towns. And then we have one section of law for counties. Cities are addressed in the general municipal laws 6C through 6T because they don't really have a particular law that addresses cities. A lot of times cities are governed by their charters and in general municipal law. So, and we're going to talk a little bit more about some of the permissive referendum and public notice referendums and requirements that are associated with some of these reserves. I indicated before that if you're going to have reserves, your local government, your limited government board should establish a reserve fund policy. And the policy should clearly talk about what is the purpose of it? How do you plan on funding it? What's the maximum amount that you intend to put in that reserve? And then have some discussion about when do you intend to expend from it, and when do you replenish it? And when it's not needed anymore, how do you intend to dispose of the residual balances? So we see reserves all the time that just show up on the balance sheets of local governments, and the same dollar amounts pretty much are reported year after year after year, maybe with a little bit of interest earnings added to it. It's not how reserves should be dealt with. They should be administered and managed properly pursuant to a reserve fund policy. So, and then they should be linked to long-term plans. Okay. Administration of reserves. If you're going to legally establish reserves, you need to have adequate, sufficient accounting records to account for all the monies within reserves. You have to have a separate set of accounts for every reserve that you establish. So if you've got 2 capital reserves, for instance, you need to have 2 separate ledgers that record the activity. So, and in your balance sheets of your local government financial reports, you're going to be reporting the cash that's for these reserves in account number 230 or 231, depending on whether it's interest-bearing accounts or not. And then your equity codes are the 800 series, which shows how your portion of your fund balance is restricted. And we'll get into that a little bit more. And then at the end of the year, typically the reserve activities are closed out to restricted fund balance at the end of the year, as opposed to being closed out to the unrestricted. And the last thing I would just mention, that governing board members are the trustees of reserves, and they can be personally responsible for that if there's illegal or unauthorized expenditures out of reserve funds. So you want to be mindful of the fact that, when you establish reserves, you have a responsibility to properly administer them and hopefully do things in pursuant to your reserve policy. We get a lot of questions about investment of reserve fund monies. Basically, you can invest reserve fund monies in accordance with General Municipal Law, Section 11, the same with all of your other monies. It should be invested pursuant to the municipality's investment policy as well. Just because General Municipal Law, Section 11 allows for certain investment opportunities, it doesn't necessarily mean that each local government wants to take advantage of that. And that's why local governments have to have investment policies that state which of the available investment opportunities they want to take advantage of. So, reserve fund monies can be commingled with other municipal monies, money for investment purposes, but interest earned should be credited to the balance of the reserve for each reserve fund. So, your accounting records should reflect that. They should show how reserve interest earnings are being added to the reserve fund. I get the question a lot of the times, do reserve funds have to have their own bank account? And you have to differentiate between what a bank account is and a cash account in the accounting records. You have to maintain separate cash accounts for all of your funds, and but you do not have to have separate bank accounts for reserve fund monies. The only time that you really have to have a separate bank account these days for local governments is when you have proceeds of debt. When you've borrowed money, generally that money has to be kept in a separate bank account until such time that you've used it all up. Just quickly, just go over some of the issues that we run into when we're auditing local governments in regard to reserve funds. You know, some of the things that we look at, you know, so if we were coming on site to your local government and we were looking at your financial records and we saw that you established reserve funds, we would look to see, did the governing board properly establish pursuant to whatever one of those laws that we just discussed authorizes. Then we look to see, are your accounting records adequate to properly manage those, you know? And when we look at that, we have to be able to determine, has the accounting records established a sufficient audit trail for us to be able to look at your bank records and your accounting records and be able to track withdrawals and additions to your reserve monies. So that's kind of the test of it. You have to make sure that you've got that audit trail within your accounting records. And then we look at, you know, are the balances reasonable? You know, that's one of the big things that we look at a lot of the times, you know. And when we try to determine whether it's a reasonable balance in a particular reserve fund, we kind of look at, first of all, what is the kind of reserve that you've established, and if it's something that is for operational purposes. Let's say for instance you're saving up for a workman's comp reserve fund, and then we would look at historically back, we would look to see what is your average contribution through your budget and through your expenditures for workman comp expenditures. And then we would try to determine how many years worth of workman comp expenditures is represented by the balance of that particular reserve fund. And unfortunately, going back to like school district audits, a lot of times we find an awful lot of reserve fund balances that are sufficient to take the district to anywhere from 25 and more years into the future. So it's certainly not how that reserve fund should be used. It's certainly not a reasonable balance. So, and then we look to see, you know, expenditures from your reserve fund, were they authorized by the board? You know, the same with increases, you know, as you put deposits into the reserves, where did the board authorize the additions to these reserves and the expenditures from it? And then lastly, a lot of times we look at, okay, when a reserve has outlived its useful life, any residual monies, unexpended balances, were they transferred in compliance with the law or and at the direction of the governing board? And we'll talk a little bit more about unexpended balances and what you can do with them. We'll talk a little bit more now about some of the common reserves. The most common, as I pointed out in one of the other slides, the capital reserve is probably the most common reserve that we see. And we're going to get into detail on capital reserves. And repair reserve, same thing. That's probably the second most popular. Followed by some of these other miscellaneous ones. The retirement contribution reserve is now becoming more and more popular. The employee benefit accrued liability, what we refer to the EBLAR reserve, also becoming more and more popular. And those four, the first four on this slide are discretionary type of reserves that boards can establish. But we also have mandatory reserves that the law requires you to put money into. And we're going to discuss that. They're related to usually the sale of a government asset if there's been debt or state aid associated with it. So capital reserves, again, the most popular one of all the reserves that we see reported, and they allow you to save money to finance all or part of the cost of a construction of a capital improvement or the purchase of a piece of equipment. Okay. They're established pursuant, for most local governments, they're established pursuant to General Municipal Law, Section 6.3C. It does not, 6C does not pertain to fire districts. Fire districts have their own section, which is General Municipal Law 6D. That should be 6D or 6G. That's a misprint on that slide. You might want to make a note of that. And then school districts, they can establish capital reserves pursuant to Education Law, Section 3651. So we're going to discuss capital reserves pursuant to General Municipal Law, Section 6C, which is the most common one. So that's going to be used for towns, villages, cities, and counties. Okay. So capital reserves are accounted for in the fund that's providing the financing. Okay. I mentioned earlier that prior to 2001, capital reserves used to be reported in the capital project fund, which is the H fund. It's not so anymore. So that changed after 2001. And now whatever fund has been providing the funding for this capital reserve, that's where the capital reserve should be reported on their balance sheet. And you report that using the 878 equity account. And that should be, that 878 account should equal the total of the 230 or the 231 cash account, because if you've segregated a portion of your fund balance, you have to have cash to support that. So you use the 230 or the 231 account to account for that cash. Now, capital reserves are often transferred to the capital project fund using a 9950.9 expenditure account. And they transfer capital reserve monies to the capital project fund to help with the cost of a project or of a purchase. Capital reserves can be established for capital purposes, which are referred to just in general, which we refer to as a type. And then they can also be established for a specific object or purpose, which we refer to as a specific capital reserve. So you're going to be hearing me talk about a type of a capital reserve and a specific capital reserve. And it makes a big difference as to which one was formed as far as referendum and public notice requirements and some of the expenditures. For towns and villages that want to establish capital reserves, generally there's a public notice and a permissive referendum notice that's put in the paper. If the purpose for what they're establishing the reserve for is if the authorization to issue debt for that same purpose would be subject to referendum, which basically means that if it's got a proposed maturity of more than 5 years, then the resolution to establish capital reserve would also be subject to the public notice and permissive referendum. And most capital reserves that you see are for a purpose that have a period of probable usefulness of more than 5 years. So they would require that. But I suppose if you had a purpose of less than that, then you wouldn't be required to have the public notice or referendum. Okay. So that's for towns and villages. Cities and counties, the public notice and referendum requirements generally are not required. Fire districts, which, as I pointed out before, are established pursuant to General Municipal Law 6G, as opposed to 6C, they're public notice and mandatory referendum for fire districts. So if a fire district wants to save money and put it into a capital reserve, they've got to get permission from the voters to do that. It's a mandatory referendum. For school districts, again, that's established by education law, section 3651. But again, it's just like it is for fire districts. It's a mandatory public notice, mandatory referendum. So the voters of that school district have to approve the establishment of a capital reserve in a school district, as well as the expenditures from that. For towns, I mean, when we talk about permissive referendum, a lot of people don't understand what that is, but for towns, it's governed by section 90 through 94. And it just generally requires that if you're going to bring about a permissive referendum, then you have to file a petition with the governing board with signatures equivalent to about 5% of at least 5% of the qualified voters who voted in the last governor election. Villages have a little bit different requirement for permissive referendum. That generally requires a petition filed by 20%, by at least 20% of those voters who voted in the last village election. So how that works is if you're going to establish a capital reserve and it's a reserve that's going to be required to be subject to public notice and permissive referendum, then the resolution is going to be published in the paper. It has the governing board has to wait a 30-day period to see if they get challenged by the voters by a petition with the required number of signatures. And if they do get a duly filed petition with the correct number of signatures, then the governing board would have to put the issue up for a referendum and let the voters decide whether they want to establish or expend from a particular capital reserve. You don't see an awful lot of challenges. I've seen a few in my years, but I haven't seen too many challenges. But as taxpayer groups get more organized and more savvy, they start to get a little bit more educated on how they can bring the challenges of this nature about. So it's good to know that what's required. So that's the difference between permissive and mandatory anyhow. When we talk about capital reserves, as I mentioned earlier, that there's usually two forms of capital reserves that we talk about. Ones that we call a specific capital reserve, and other ones that are called a type. And so a type of a capital reserve is just this chart shows examples of that. It's when you're being more general in nature. As to what it is that you're saving up for, So you could have a capital reserve for land purchases or capital reserve for buildings, and without being specific as to exactly what land or what buildings that you're saving up for, that's an example of a type. And so A lot of times at local government levels, we see type of capital reserves labeled as, snow removal equipment or highway equipment or fire apparatus in villages or whatever, you know. Whereas a specific capital reserve, that's as the name implies, you're being specific as to what it is that you're saving up the money for. And that makes a difference as to when you need to put the public notice in to the paper, because you have to provide the taxpayers with information as to what it is that you're saving up for so that they know whether they want to challenge that. So, examples of specific capital reserves would be for a town hall, or saving up for a highway garage, or for particular types of equipment like bulldozers and fire engines and things like that. So when you become specific, the rules are going to change as to the public notice and referendum requirements come in, and then so we're going to explain the difference in how that comes about. Okay. A specific capital reserve, when you establish a specific reserve, you have to comply with the public notice and permissive referendum requirements when the governing board wants to establish it. Okay. So, for example, if your governing board was wishing to establish a capital reserve for a snowplow, which is specific, okay, that resolution, the public notice would indicate that there was a resolution passed to establish a capital reserve to save up for a snowplow, and that this resolution is subject to permissive referendum. Inside that resolution would be the maximum cost of the snowplow that you want to save up for. Okay. And when you get ready to expend from it, then the governing board just has to pass a resolution. They don't have to go back to the voters again. So when you set up a specific capital reserve, you take care of the public notice and permissive referendum right up front. Put the notice in the paper, you wait your 30 days. If you don't get a challenge from the voters in your local area, then you can go ahead and put money into that reserve and start saving it up for such time that you need the money to be used. So in our local government management guide, there's a sample resolution in the Appendix C of that local management guide that I showed you at the start of the presentation. It's like a boilerplated resolution, kind of a fill in the blanks type of resolution that you can use for establishing a specific capital reserve. In contrast, a type of a capital reserve, there's no referendum requirements right up front when you first create it. Your governing board could establish a type of a capital reserve at tonight's meeting and start funding it immediately. So for example, if you're going back to the other example, if your governing board wanted to establish some type of a capital reserve for highway equipment, for instance, without being specific as to what it is, then they could just establish a highway equipment capital reserve. That resolution is not going to have a maximum dollar amount in the resolution because you don't know what it is, exactly what it is you're saving for. So the public notice and the referendum requirements kick in before you expend from that particular reserve. So with both the specific and the type, there's going to be public notice and permissive referendum requirements at one end or the other. But with a type, it happens after you save the money up and get ready to expend from it. That's when you'd have to put your resolution in the paper and make the notice the fact that it's subject to permissive referendum. After you wait your 30 days, if you don't get any challenge, typically then you can just expend upon board direction, expend from that reserve without having to go back to the voters. For towns, if a highway equipment reserve exists, in order to expend from it and establish it, it's upon the recommendation of the town highway superintendent. Villages don't have any similar requirements like that because they don't have town highway superintendents. And again, in our local management guide, we have a sample resolution in Appendix D with a resolution, a boilerplated resolution, again, fill in the blanks that you can use for establishing a type of capital reserve. And when you compare the two boilerplated resolutions to one another, you'll notice that the specific one has a spot where you have to put the maximum dollar amount in, where the resolution for a type would not have that. I don't know if this is going to apply to anybody that's in the audience today, but there are special provisions that if your town is wholly or partly in the Adirondack Park, it has state lands subject to taxation, assessed at more than 30%, the state controller's office must consent to the establishment and expenditures of capital reserves in the town. And I would just urge you to make sure that you check with the town assessor to determine the portion of taxable state lands. State lands are only taxable within the Adirondack Park, and this provision is there because if the state of New York is a significant taxpayer in this town, it's their opportunity to bring about the equivalent of what a permissive referendum is for an average taxpayer. So, and on our website, under the legal section, you can get copies of how to apply for this type of permission. I don't know if it's going to affect anybody here. Maybe somebody up in the Lewis, St. Lawrence County area, perhaps. We might have a few towns that are affected by that. Okay. Unexpended balances in capital reserves. It's going to make a difference whether it's a type or a specific capital reserve. And it also makes a difference as to whether you've completed the acquisition or the purchase of the project or whatever. And so for a type of a capital reserve, if you've got unexpended balances and you've completed the acquisition or the project, then you can transfer any of this residual money to another capital reserve with the same tax base without any referendum requirements. And I stress the fact that it's got to be within the same tax base. For a specific reserve, whereby the project's completed or the purchase was made and you have leftover money, then the leftover money can be used for any object or purpose for which debt can be issued, or with limited exceptions for the payment of interest and principal on the debt. So and then we look at unexpended balances that for capital reserves, they were never utilized. So for example, if we have let's say we established a specific reserve for a purchase of a snow plow for the town. And you had $200,000 sitting in it, and suddenly you realize that you really didn't need to purchase this snowplow, and perhaps you maybe want to use it for a different purpose. Then with a specific type of reserve like that, that you may transfer to another capital reserve with the same tax base, but that transfer is going to be subject to permissive referendum. You would have obviously have had first to establish the other capital reserve. But in order to move the money from one reserve to another, then it's going to be subject to permissive referendum. Or subject to a public hearing within 15-day notice, you can transfer the money, all or a portion of it, to a retirement contribution reserve. And as the slide at the bottom tells you, that we strongly to encourage you to consult with legal counsel before exercising either of these options. It can get complicated, as can a lot of options related to reserve funds. Boards are well served to consult with their municipal attorneys and or our legal division in Albany when you have questions related to establishment and the use of any reserves. So that kind of covers capital reserves. It's, like I said, they're the most popular, and you really have to decide whether you want to establish a type or a specific, because as I mentioned, the permissive referendum and public notice requirements are a little bit different for each of them. So get familiar with our local management guide. It does a real good job of describing everything that you need to know about capital reserves. The other common type of reserve that we see quite often is repair reserves. They're established pursuant to General Municipal Law, Section 6D. And they're used to pay for the cost of certain repairs to like buildings or equipment that are of a type that not reoccurring annually or shorter intervals. Okay, we use the 882 equity account on the balance sheet to segregate the fund balance for that, and we use the 230 and the 231 cash accounts to record where the debt is sitting. There's no public notice or referendum requirements to establish a repair reserve. You can establish that at any governing board meeting, and you could start funding it immediately. You don't have to put the public notice in the paper for that. However, you require to have a public hearing needed before the reserve is appropriated and spent. So, if you've got $30,000 sitting in a repair reserve and somebody comes to and says, hey, we need to make a significant repair to a piece of equipment, for instance, then you would have to put a notice of a public hearing in. A lot of times governing boards do that in conjunction with a regular scheduled meeting. A notice has to be put in the paper saying that you're going to have a public hearing to discuss the use of reserve fund monies, or repair reserve monies. There are times that you can expend from a repair reserve without a public hearing in times of a true emergency. Emphasis on a true emergency. The lack of planning for something does not constitute an emergency. So it has to be a true emergency. And if one exists, then you could expend from your repair reserve without having a public hearing. But if you do that, you have to replenish 50% of it the next year and the remainder in the following year. For unexpended balances and repair reserves, in general, all or part of the repair reserve fund can be transferred to a capital reserve fund or to a contingency and tax stabilization reserve fund. And we're going to talk a little bit about those in a minute. Okay. You can also transfer to a retirement contribution reserve subject to a public hearing within 15 days notice. So those are your two options if you have unexpended balances in a repair reserve. Retirement contribution reserves are becoming more and more popular, especially as local governments' contributions to the New York State retirement system fluctuate depending on what's happening with the economy. So, you know, the law allows you, General Municipal Law, Section 6R governs retirement contributions, and it allows you to set money aside for future contributions to the New York State retirement system. You'd use the 827 equity account and the 230 and the 231 cash accounts on your balance sheets to record the activity with them. They're established by board resolution. There is no permissive referendum or public notice requirements with retirement contributions. You can expend from them just by simply board resolution. And you can transfer into certain other reserves after a public hearing. And again, our reserve publication that I was talking about at the beginning of this presentation does a good job of talking about, you know, what you can do with these leftover monies in every one of these reserves. The retirement contribution reserve recently got expanded or amended. They amended General Municipal Law 6R to include contributions for school districts to be putting money into the teachers' retirement system fund. Prior to that, it was only the employee, the ERS, and the police and fire retirement system that was allowed to have contributions in a reserve, in a retirement contribution reserve. But now school districts can create a sub-fund with certain limitations, annual contributions that can't exceed 2% of the teacher's salaries, for instance, and the total balance of the sub-fund can't exceed more than 10% of total teacher's salaries that year. So, you know, it's something new that got added to 6R because school districts were saying for years, you know, we need to also be able to save money up for our teachers' retirement system. So now they have it. Employee benefit accrued liability reserve, that's what we refer to as the EBLR, established General Municipal Law 6P. It's basically established so you can save up money if your municipality has allowed employees to get a cash value for accumulated unused leave time upon separation of employment with your government. We use the 867 equity code and the 230 and 231 cash accounts to account for that reserve as well. Okay. No public notice or permissive referendum issues established with this. It's simply board resolution to establish and a board resolution to expend. It's your reserve fund policy should talk about maximum dollar amounts in this type of a reserve. For instance, it should equal what the local government is reporting on their balance sheets, for instance, for compensated absences under the liability section of your. So there should be a calculation of your compensated balance liability, and your EBLR reserve should be funded it should be funded in line with that liability. It shouldn't have more than what you've calculated to need for compensated absences. EBLAR reserve monies cannot be used for other things like retirement incentives or things like that. It can only be used to pay the cash value of accumulated and unused leave time, such as like sick time or vacation time, upon termination of the employment. The next one we'll talk about is contingency and tax stabilization reserve. I don't see as many of these, but from time to time that you see them, it's just to finance unanticipated revenue losses or unanticipated expenditures, or prevent projected increases of more than 2.5% needed in taxes to finance the eligible portion of your annual budget. So probably, given the times that we're in right now, it would probably be nice if you maybe had a contingency and tax stabilization reserve. There's limitations to it, but you'd be able to use a portion of it, of this money saved up for these reasons. So it's reported using the 880 equity account and the 230 and 231 cash accounts. Board resolution subject to public notice and permissive referendum requirements to establish it. There's certain limitations. The balance can't exceed 10% of the eligible portion of the annual budget. Now, if you look at our reserve manual, you'll see where they define the eligible portion of the annual budget for villages and cities and counties. That would be your general fund. For towns, you have your eligible portion would be the townwide general and the townwide highway together, as well as the part-town general and the part-town highway together. So towns have two eligible funds that they can have a contingency and tax stabilization reserve in, whereas villages, cities, and counties would only be in the general fund. Okay, and then there's certain limitations on the use of the money. I mean, we talked earlier about the fact that it can't exceed 10% of the eligible, the overall balance, but there's also certain limitations on the use of it each year. And it's pretty complicated. They talk about it in detail in our reserve manual. It's basically just, you have to look at the difference between budgeted amounts and actual amounts in order to determine how much could be spent. So I would encourage you to, if you're interested in contingency and tax stabilization reserves, take a look at the pages in our manual that discusses that, so that you understand it before you make a decision to establish one. And then the mandatory reserve funds, I talked about them earlier, that these are the ones that are not a discretionary type of thing. The law mandates under certain conditions that monies have to be restricted and put in to what we call a mandatory reserve that are discussed in General Municipal Law, Section 6L. Okay, and it covers conditions such as when the proceeds of the cash sale of capital improvements that still have debt outstanding. So if you've got an asset, for instance, or a capital improvement that you sold, and that asset has debt still outstanding on it, the proceeds of the debt, the proceeds of the cash, have to be put in a mandatory reserve and used to be such time to retire the outstanding debt. The other condition is when you receive state and federal aid after debt has been issued for a capital project, then you have to put that into a mandatory reserve fund. And we use the 884 equity account and the 230 and 231 cash account. Typically, that mandatory reserves, it's indicated, it's anticipated that you would be using the debt service fund to report that, and that those monies should reside in the debt service fund, which is the V fund. So, but I do see them from time to time, the mandatory reserves also shown in other operating funds like the general fund. We don't get real critical of that, but they're intended to be reported and recorded in the debt service fund. And they have to be used to retire the outstanding debt to finance it. And we see that abused quite often. We see money that gets sent down to the debt service fund and put it into a mandatory reserve. And it sits year after year after year. Nobody ever transfers it to be used to pay principal and interest. So that's a common audit finding. We find you shouldn't just, send it down to the debt service fund and let it sit there. You should be send it down to the debt service fund, and then each year you should be transferring it out of there in order to pay the annual debt service on the particular loan that it's associated with. And as the bottom of the slide says, in addition, local finance law, section 165, also requires any unneeded money borrowed for capital improvements to be restricted to retire outstanding debt. Those monies would also be typically sent to a debt service fund and restricted in that 884 account, but it's not truly a mandatory reserve pursuant to General Municipal Law 6L, but local finance law also requires unneeded monies that have been borrowed for a capital project or for a purchase to be put in the debt service fund and only to be used to retire the outstanding debt. Some other less common reserves that you can get more information on in the local management guides, and we don't see them as often, but they're out there. And snow and ice removal, solid waste facility, workman's comp one, that's and the unemployment reserve. Those are fairly common. Depending on the situations. In order to use the workman's comp establish, you must be a government that's self-insured for workman's comp. And for the unemployment reserve, you have to be a government that has elected to become liable for actual unemployment contributions. So depending on your situation, you may or may not qualify for that. Both the workman's comp and the unemployment reserve, they have provisions that you'll see in our management guide that say that at the end of every year, that a governing board can make a determination that any unneeded monies can be appropriated, all or portion of it can be appropriated for the purpose that was, so basically you can move some of it back to the operating fund to take care of workman comp or unemployment expenses that year, but you have to leave enough in those reserves to fund future liabilities. That's a little bit different than a lot of the other reserves, because a lot of other reserves don't ever give you an opportunity to return any of the money back to the operating fund. Most of them require you to transfer them to another reserve fund. So these are some of the less known ones. I don't know if you're going to ever have a need for those, but the manual will do a good job of describing them and kind of make you familiar with them as so you can decide whether you want to take advantage of them or not. It kind of brings us to, okay, now we've discussed how to establish reserves, what's the benefit of them, how to administer them, how to record and report them. And then, really, as I mentioned earlier, reserves are a planning tool. So, hopefully you'll blend your reserves into your long-term planning needs. And so you can project for several years into the future. Typically, we recommend long-term planning to be not more than 3 to 5 years out. But you should certainly start looking at long-term planning initiatives. A government should not be operating just based upon an annual budget each year. There's no private business that I could ever think of that could survive if it only looked 1 year down the road. And it's the same thing with governments. Governments need to look further down the road than 1 year. So, you need to make projections as to how certain expenditure commitments that you might be able to make, decisions made by governing boards about taking on new services or investing in certain capital investments or whatever. How is that going to affect your fund balances and your cash flows? You need to look at the what if scenarios. And we have an excellent publication called Multi-Year Financial Planning. It's another one of our local government guides. It's the same spot on our website that you go to get the reserve publication. It's an excellent publication as well that talks about everything you need to know about multi-year financial planning. It's got excellent information about that, about what types of projections you need to make, the benefits of it, and how boards need to establish these multi-year plans. At the same spot on our website, you'll also see a reference to a planning template. It's an Excel file that you can use. It has in the same area, it has a tutorial where the template is. There's a tutorial that kind of walks you through using it. It's an excellent tool. You can tweak it to your own needs. So you can eliminate some of the rows or some of the columns or whatever and tweak it to your own needs. It's I've seen it used very effectively by some local governments. And I would really encourage you to kind of take a look at it. And we actually have a webinar that's going to be held on the 30th, which I guess is Thursday, on long-term planning. So that's available on our website. There's the announcement for it, should be on one of your last slides there. It talks about April 30th, the webinar. There's information there. Hopefully you could go to that site and register for the long-term planning. They call it multi-year planning. I would encourage you to get familiar with that and maybe attend that webinar. I know we've covered an awful lot of information in a short amount of time. I wanted to be able to leave time for questions or whatever. So I guess at this point I would probably entertain whatever questions that you have.
Thank you, Laird. And I'll just repeat, if anyone has a question, please use the chat function. And when you are asking your question, please let us know what type of government you represent, whether it's a town or a village, because that will help Laird answer your question better. As well, we'll take a minute to let everybody put any questions they might have into the chat. It might be risky, but I could try the unmuting all to see if anybody wants to ask a question verbally. So hold on. Yep,
Get out for
froze up. Okay. Laird, can you hold on? Can you hear me?
I can hear you, yeah.
Okay. So we do have a question on highway reserve resolutions. Hiel Musab asked, you mentioned town highway superintendent approval. Does that mean the county does not need to approve anymore?
For highway equipment, capital reserves, if you look at the language in General Municipal Law 6C, it does indicate that there has to be in order to establish and expend from a capital reserve for highway equipment, it has to be on the recommendation of the town highway superintendent, and it does say that the county highway superintendent as well. In actual practice, and in talking to county highway superintendents over the years, I know of none of them that get involved with that. But to the letter of the law, to the best of my knowledge, GML 6C still includes language pertaining to permission from the county highway superintendent as well. And I think our local management guide reserve publication still indicates that too.
Thank you, Laird. We do have another question. Laird, is there a way to rescind a town board resolution that establishes a capital reserve fund, and under what circumstances could that be done? Thank you.
Yep, the answer would be yes. You can rescind one resolution if you've established a capital reserve for a particular purpose and you want to change that. You can change it to another purpose in another reserve, to another capital reserve, but you can't just rescind the resolution and take the money and put it back into the operating fund and use it for other purposes. It has to be used in accordance to what I was showing in the one slide there where we were talking about if you had a specific reserve, for instance, that was not utilized and you wanted to use it for something else, you have to follow the rules as far as where to move it to. But you can't just move it back to general fund balance in the operating fund.
Great.
I should have mentioned during the presentation is from time to time, we come across situations where local governments have been reporting a reserve fund, and upon closer look, we find that the governing board never really established them properly. But if they have been holding it out to the public in financial reports and other documents that a portion of that fund balance is reserved, even though they didn't legally establish it, we always recommend that be treated as a de facto reserve. And rather than just take the monies that have been being held out to the public as being reserved and put back in the operating fund, the board should then go through the proper procedures to legally establish that reserve. So it's what we call de facto reserves, and it comes up quite often in our audits.
Thank you, Laird. So the next question is OSC going to load more examples of reserve resolutions besides the two that are in the reserve manual? They detail that there really is an issue because most local municipal attorneys are not comfortable with reserve language and rules, and that most reserve resolutions available by searching on the internet are 10 years old, so they're not sure of the accuracy.
Yeah, I mean, the only resolutions that I'm aware of that we provide are in that local management guide, and they relate to a type and a specific capital reserve. We're not allowed to provide a lot of boilerplated documents to local governments because we have to audit the local government. So we have to operate it within our independence constraints. I know there doesn't have to be a lot of formal legal language, I guess, in a resolution, as much as it is more importantly that you get the important content in the resolution as to what it is that the board wants to establish, and refer to the particular section of law. Like if you're establishing a repair reserve, for instance, the resolution should start out by saying that pursuant to General Municipal Law 6D, the board wishes to establish a repair reserve fund, language of that nature. It really doesn't have to be that specific as it has to be, it has to have the important content on it so that the intent of the board is clear. As an auditor, I look at resolutions a lot of the times, and you can tell some resolutions have been prepared by an attorney. Other resolutions are probably drawn up by the board themselves, and we don't get too hung up on the difference as long as we can decipher what the intent of the board was and whether they did it pursuant to the proper section of law. Don't know if that answers the question, but.
Sure. There were a few more comments from the same person that asked. I guess clarifying a little more. He said asking for a wider variety of reserve resolution samples because there aren't many samples available from the existing sources. Sorry, I lost my spot when I tried to go down. And he said, oh, okay, so he said there aren't many samples from the Association of Towns, NICOM, NISAC, or New York State GFOA, and that they think the issue comes up with the referendum requirements and that language in the reserve.
Well, I'm not sure I totally understand the question, I guess. I understand that from what they're saying is that their Association of Towns and NICOM aren't able to provide them with any more sample resolutions, if I'm understanding it correctly. But I don't know what it is that's being asked of. Are they asking whether the OSC can provide more examples?
Yes, I believe so.
Yeah, that would be something I would have to run through our legal division. All of our publications have to be reviewed by our legal division. And so I'm sure when somebody made the determination to put the resolutions in the back of the appendix items in the reserve manual, that somebody in our legal division had to review that and approve that. Whether would they be agreeable to doing that for other reserves, I'm not sure. I certainly have something I could pass on as something that's being asked.
Yeah, that seems like a good next step. Another question we have is, Laird, in your opinion, during the period when local government liquidity is under extreme pressure, do you think the governor would consider an executive order in which amounts in reserve funds, in which amounts of reserve funds could be used by local governments to replenish their general fund balances?
It's possible, I guess. I've been looking at the executive orders. It's been expanded a couple different times, covering different aspects of local government activities. I haven't seen any discussion about allowing reserve funds and restrictions related to them being relaxed to help out with, I'm assuming they're talking about like the coronavirus issues and like that. I haven't seen it. I haven't heard anybody discussing that at OSC. But every week they're meeting and talking about different things like that, and the governor is making suggestions as well. So I don't know. I suspect that they're going to be looking at a lot of issues down the road here as to how we can help local governments with financial issues when their state and federal revenues aren't going to be there like they've been used to.
Great. Any other comment? The Pia Masao, who had asked earlier about more examples, he just commented that more examples would be a great help, and thanks. So if that's something you can take back to
I will certainly pass that on.
great. Are there any other questions for Laird? Carla, I realize I still have you on mute, so I'm going to take you off mute, Carla, in case there's something else you would want to say.
No, I just want to say thank you for attending, everyone. It's been great to see you. Right? And thank you, Laird and Emily, for hosting. Appreciate it.
We can wait another minute or two in case anyone thinks of anything else. And then, of course, you can always contact Laird at the contact information on the slide.
Right, that email address that's shown on that last slide, the Muni Syracuse one, I monitor that mailbox, so I would be able to receive any questions and hopefully answer them.
And we had a comment just saying thank you very much and stay well.
Same to everybody. I hope everybody stays safe, and these are crazy times that we're in. But I think if we keep this serious and stay in, I think we'll get past this.
So in the chat, I did put the link to where we've been corralling the presentations that would have been held at the local government conference last month. So we will add this webinar and we'll add the slides. And I'm going to put my email address in the chat. If there's anything that you need from me, do not hesitate.
Are we still live?
Yeah.
Okay.
I had we had a few thank yous, and I have something to copying a comment to you privately, Laird. And you don't have to comment on that. I was just sharing it with you.
I guess on my screen, I'm not seeing those anyway, so.
Oh, I think you have to open the chat sort of at the bottom.
Oh,
If you scroll towards the bottom, there'll be a number of icons, and one of them is one of those comment bubbles, and that's where you can go to see the chats. All right, well, I'm going to stop recording the webinar now, and thank you all for joining, and we'll share this as soon as we can on the Tug Hill Commission website.
great. Thank you.